Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's really an honor to be here at SAR and to have the time to work on this project that is very meaningful to me for many, many reasons. And I want to start off by honoring our ancestors because they survived, and also the ancestors of the people of the land that we're standing on, because it's significant and it means something for where we are. And then before I start, I want to thank my wife, who is here, Rosa, because in the very gender segregated norms of the community where I worked, which is the community where she's from and where my father is from, I wouldn't have been able to navigate some of the spaces that I was in with women if I hadn't been with her, or if she wouldn't have brokered some of that for me. So the title of my talk today is Resurgent Indigeneity, Remaking Indigena and Community Through Education. And it's purposefully re/making because I myself am still trying to piece through whether it's a remaking or a making, right? Is it a resurgence or an ethnogenesis? And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. First, a little bit of disclosure. As Michael said, my family comes from the community of San Miguel Nocutzepo. It's historically a Purépecha community with many transitions due to colonialism and other forces that have changed culturally and linguistically in the community over time. Migrations, because there's been a lot of out-migration from the community, both to urban centers in Mexico and to the United States, hence Los Angeles, where I was born in 1972. Indigena in the sense that growing up, I didn't have a clear sense of my own ethnicity. There's so many labels put on Latinos, Hispanics, Mexican Americans, Chicanos, and so indigena was something that kept resurging in my own life in different periods of time, many times with family members making references to when we were Indians or when we were more Indian, always as if it was something that could be diluted or changed, right? It wasn't until college that I actually started to do more research on my own family background, and instead of studying for my classes, I was reading about the history of the area where my family was from. I started asking more questions. I started digging through archives and documents, and I found this photo. This photo is of my grandparents. This is my grandmother, who still wore her Purépecha dress in the 1950s. This is my grandfather. Story goes that he was a bracero, and he came to work in the United States in the sugar beet fields of Colorado. And he so admired the farmers, the American farmers who wore overalls, that when he returned to Mexico, he took a pair of overalls, and he never stopped wearing them ever again. This is my great-grandfather, Miguel Urrieta, and he was born in the 19th century. And he lived to be 103 years old. This is my aunt, my dad's oldest sister. And these are two teachers that were visiting the community from a regional center in Pátzcuaro. The story goes, my aunt says that these teachers taught the women how to make dresses so that they could learn to dress like civilized people. So in her generation was when they actually stopped wearing this type of dress and started wearing this type of dress. Fulbright and researcher, because that's another part of my identity. I was actually in the community in 2009-2010 for a full year of ethnography. And it was interesting to be back. I had never really lived there for more than a couple of weeks, a month, and to actually immerse myself in community life, which is very much tied to being a good family member, to being a good community member, to learning these concepts of convivir, to co-live, or to actually share life together as a collective, and also to co-labor, to work together, right? The collective work that is the basis of the community. And so with that, this work is not my work alone. It's the work of a lot of different people that have helped with their words, with their insight, with their critiques to make this work happen. Some of the methods, just briefly, participant observation mainly, family, household, and public daily practices, community collective events, rituals. I did a lot of work in a local public library because Once they found out that I was very fluent in English because they had never heard me speak English, they wanted me to teach their kids English lessons, which I did. And then, of course, the bilingual intercultural school, which is the topic of this talk. There were a lot of interviews, ethnographic interviews, semi-structured, unstructured, surveys, life history, town history, migration history. My research took me into the archives, local archives, the town archive, municipal archives, el Archivo Histórico de Pátzcuaro, el Archivo General de la Nación, the CREFAL archive. Interestingly, to the US National Archives and the foreign assistance programs that were being carried out in Mexico through the Green Revolution in the 1950s, and records of US foreign assistance agencies. There's a lot of video, there's a lot of photography. Basically, this project has been ongoing for about 10 years. So a little bit about the community. San Miguel Nocutzepo. Nocutzepo in the Purépecha language means lugar del valle, or the place of the valley. It appears in the early Bowman and Cellar maps of the area drawn between 1538 and 39 in the current location where it is at. There are references in historical documents from the 16th through the 18th century of people from Nocutzepo as indios or naturales, which was often the terms that were used to refer to indigenous people. Nocutzepo is a smaller community. Since the 1980s, it hasn't grown very much, from around 800 people. Because it was a smaller community, it wasn't assigned by the royal crown the status of a república. So it wasn't given an autonomous status. It was always a barrio of a neighborhood in the city of Pátzcuaro. Because it was under that jurisdiction, it didn't have some of the legal protections to maintain its own autonomy in different ways. And so throughout the different centuries, because of its proximity to the Hacienda Charagüen and the need for workers at the Hacienda, the movement of Native people from communities, from one community to another community due to the demands of labor, there was a lot of influx of different people that came into the community, that stayed for periods of time, others that stayed and settled in the community, and that changed the composition of the community over time. But there was very clearly in the work that I did a memory of being Tarasco. Tarasco is the Spanish word for Purépecha. The community clearly has usos y costumbres, which is sort of the marker for what makes an indigenous community. So the ritual practices, the dances, and things like that are part of the community life. And also a struggle with the state-sanctioned forms of indigeneity that the Mexican government propagates, right? Mainly in its current form, the census, and whether you can speak an indigenous language if you're over 5 years old, right? If you can speak an indigenous language and you're over 5 years old, then you are counted as a native person. If you don't, then you are no longer considered a native. And the INI, the Instituto Nacional Indigenista, which was created in 1941 and centralized in 1948, which also had a very romanticized idea of what native meant, right? So mainly that had to do with being able to speak a native language and wearing traditional dress, right? This is an image of Dia de los Muertos in 2009, and I show it just to show the contrast between, the very traditional, there are still some very traditional older women, and the changes that you'll see in other slides. So I wanted to frame the talk the way that I'm framing the book, mainly the economic practices related to the land and the land tenure, the education and the history of education in the community, and also the identity, what it means or what it has meant to be indigenous in the community over time. Marisol de la Cadena says that indio, or the signifier indio, is a floating signifier, right? That is impacted and that changes due to the local socioeconomic and political conditions of the context that it is used, right? And so in that sense, I'm referring to the term indio or Indian. So in terms of the economic conditions, I want to start with this slide, but then I'll get into more detail about it. Nocutzepo was a pilot community for Green Revolution programs. Basically, the U.S. Agency for International Aid and the CREFAL, which is the local regional educational and alphabetization organization sponsored by UNESCO, went into a lot of the communities in the Pátzcuaro area to promote education programs, health programs, changes in agricultural practices. In an interview in 1963, Harvey Beatty from Montana State College said that he operated a laboratory in Mexico for agricultural innovation, and it was in these communities of the Pátzcuaro area. What this did is it introduced a lot of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and other modern agricultural practices would really change the way that the community conducted their farming. Unfortunately, a lot of that led to soil erosion, the contamination of Lake Pátzcuaro, which is in its dying stage. And then with the introduction of neoliberal practices, NAFTA mainly, the focus on agro-export economies, right? The production of avocado, which the Wall Street Journal referred to Michoacán avocados as the equivalent of blood diamonds in Africa, due to the ways in which they have become enmeshed with narco-trafficking, violence, kidnappings, and things like that. If you add to that foreign corn competition, while NAFTA supported and subsidized agricultural exports like avocados in the US, NAFTA also subsidized the production of corn, right? Oftentimes genetically modified corn, which then flooded the Mexican economy and displaced the native varieties of corn that people had grown for centuries. So what this leads to is a context of few economic returns and very limited economic opportunities. So these are some of the precarious conditions that are existent in the community, and I'm giving you this as a backdrop because the mother struggle that I'm going to talk about, in order to understand really why it happened, when it happened, and how it's connected to these larger issues, you really have to understand the context, right? So land tenure has always been in tension with the local hacienda. It was always in conflict, including armed struggle over different time periods. As early as 1646, there's a document about challenging the boundaries of the community's land claims to the hacendado. And an hacienda is like a plantation, for those of you that don't know. So it wasn't until 1917 with land reform, with the 1917 Constitution, the Nocutzepo was actually awarded 15 hectares of communal lands. It was actually awarded double the lands that it was supposed to get because the neighboring community of Tocuaro, which is actually where my mom's from, was heavily influenced by Catholicism and by synarchists. And so they refused to accept the land grants that the government was giving to them because they were convinced that if they accepted these land grants, it would be the equivalent of stealing from the plantation owner. So Nocutzepo was actually awarded twice the land that it was supposed to get. So the economy was based on subsistence agriculture, mainly growing corns, beans, and squash, as they had always done. And then also traditional artisanry, some woodworks, and also embroidery by women. As I already mentioned, between 1951 and 1969, we had this intervention of Green Revolution programs, USAID and El Crefal, which changed the production of agriculture in the community. Then we have NAFTA in 1994, which lifted in 1997 restrictions on avocado imports from Mexico. There had been an avocado ban from Mexico for over 80 years prior to NAFTA. This also led to the sale of ejido lands and land grabs after 1992, which changed the Mexican Constitution to privatize ejidos to make them able to be sold outside of the community. And so in 2000, you have the rise of this agribusiness, or the oro verde, right, the green gold, the avocado production. Through land grabs, entire mountains were cleared for avocado production. For example, it's a $1 billion business. Over 80% of the avocados that we consume in the United States come from Michoacán. And over half the avocados that are consumed in the world come from Michoacan. It's interesting because with the new Trans-Pacific partnership, it would actually increase the demand for avocado to markets in other parts of the world, right? And actually, in preparation for that, in July of 2016, the United States lifted its ban on avocados from other parts of Mexico. So what's happening in Michoacan can actually and will actually probably happen in other parts of Mexico. So with this rise in agribusiness, you also had the rise of narco cartels, narco trafficking, starting in 2000 with the Zetas, which were remnants of the Golfo cartel, and also cartels from Guatemala. The Familia Michoacana replaced the Zetas in 2006, and then they were displaced by Los Caballeros Templarios in 2009. They were followed by Nueva Creación Jalisco in 2011, 2012, and in 2016 we had the rise of the Nueva Familia Michoacana. So what does this mean? All of these cartels are deeply enmeshed with the agricultural producers in this area. They kidnap, they intimidate people to give up their lands, the land grabs. They extortion people. So if people have a small plot of avocado, they have to pay a quota for whatever they produce. So whenever we consume avocados here, we're indirectly contributing to the narco economy, right? And by the way, the day that we have the largest consumption of avocado is on Super Bowl Sunday, right? So what does it mean to have agricultural ejido communities with increasingly less agriculture, right? In this context where, one, the land no longer produces due to the soil erosion and to the overuse of synthetic fertilizers, and also to this new agribusiness economy, which is focused on this monocultural product, right? It doesn't mean that people are not going to respond to these issues. In 2013, we have the autodefensas with the example of the pueblo of Cheranqueri, which really stood up to the cartels and actually expelled them from the community and has since run its own autonomous government. But it has really impacted the economy in a lot of ways. For example, in tourism, this area had heavy tourism, international tourism, for its huge celebration of Day of the Dead. Since 2009, tourism has almost completely stopped. And so even people who make artisanry or who sell different kinds of arts have a hard time making a living. People have resorted to temporary low-paying jobs and to more traditional ways of subsisting, like bartering. So for example, the exchange of corn for tomatoes or vegetables or other forms of goods. Right? Kidnappings have always been sort of part of the local history. From the time of the colonial period, people were being kidnapped, sent to different haciendas to work in sugar mills, mines. Out-migration through the Bacero program started a pattern of people leaving the community to the United States. There's a huge dependence on remittances. But with the militarization of the border, people are increasingly becoming dissuaded to actually migrate. There's been an increase in deportations under the Obama administration. And so there's also a return of people who they call los deportados, who a lot of times are young men who have lived their whole lives in the United States, who got into some kind of trouble with the law, and who are now back in a community where they've never lived. A lot of times really not able to integrate themselves or to fully function in the community as well. And so that's led to local gangs, drug use, and things like that. There's also a strong movement that emphasizes the right to stay, right? Or the right to not have to leave the community. A lot of the people that have really paid attention to that idea of staying are people who have daughters, who don't want to see their daughters leave the community. And so the only options that people have are, like I said, low-paying jobs, mostly as domestic servants or men in construction in local areas. In terms of education, briefly, the Constitution of 1917 demanded that any hacienda that had workers in them provide education for children. And so the first school really in the community started in 1917 when the Hacienda Charagüen hired a teacher to teach the children how to read and write. With the creation of the SEP, the Secretaría de Educación Pública, or the Ministry of Education in 1921, the first school was built in Nocutzepo, Hogar y Patria, home and country, which really emphasized the ideals of the Mexican Revolution, nationalism, assimilation. In the 1950s and 60s, you have the intervention of the CREFAL, which is this regional adult education program, which really, through the documents that I've analyzed, had a very deficit view of the community. They didn't really see any industry in the community. They described people as dirty. And so a lot of their programs were basic sanitary skills, first aid, and things like that. At that time, there was also conflict in the community in the 1950s over two schools. So this idea of conflict over the schools and having two schools has been recurring throughout the time period. And usually people in the community divide themselves or align themselves according to their political party affiliation. There was another conflict over education in the late 1970s, where the INI, the National Indigenous Institute, intervened and actually opened up an indigenous school. That conflict in the 70s was very, very violent. Actually, in the process, and it pains me, my grandmother passed away because of a skirmish that happened in the community between women, which led to the creation of a new school in 1977, Benito Juarez Elementary School, which actually is the school in conflict in 2005 and where the story of the mothers begins, right? Well, it doesn't begin there, but this is the backdrop for it. So generally, education in the community has been approached in deficit. The deficit perspective by teachers of children, of the families, and of the community, because the teachers have tended not to be from the community, but outsiders that come in and teach. And also harsh discipline policies, including corporal punishment of children, which led to the conflict in 2005. So the 2005 struggle, basically because of these conditions of deficit, right, the parents persistently complained about verbal abuse and physical abuse of the children by the teachers. So Ana, a mother, a 35-year-old mother, in 2009 shared with me, and I'll read the English and you can read the Spanish, or do you want me to read the Spanish and you read the English? I don't think I have time for both. Okay. At the school, one of the teachers used to show up drunk, and the mothers raised this issue with the principal. And instead of addressing the issue, the principal would give the teacher the keys to one of the classrooms so he could sleep in there until he felt better. That was what made everybody angry. So these types of conditions where the teachers really had no regard for the kids or for their job, right? Another mother, Veronica, also shared, in her mid-30s, also shared, my daughter was ignored by her teacher and was not allowed to go to the restroom until one day she peed there, and that made me very angry because my daughter came home crying. And that was another issue, right, that the mothers raised. They wanted a new bathroom for the kids. It was in really bad condition. It was a latrine. The boards were about to break. The mothers always were afraid that the kids might just fall into it. Odelia, a younger mother in her late 20s, added, ¿Cómo es posible? Mi hija estaba para entrar al tercer grado y no sabía leer y tenía puros 9 y 10. ¿Cómo es posible que tengas esas calificaciones y no sepas leer? And I did that so you can read it. Keep you awake. So how could they be getting good grades and not know how to read, right? The mothers were aware that their children had few opportunities available to them. Carmen commented, we know that the land does not produce anymore. We burnt it, and it's sad. To us, well, we know that more, to the US, well, we know that's more of a myth than anything. So what's left? School. It's education, the only thing that we can give them, their children, right? So their perspectives of education are actually support education, right? Whereas the perspectives of the teachers were generally that the mothers didn't support education. They had a strong desire for their kids to be educated. One of the mothers, Lydia, recalled the principal's abrupt response when the mesa directiva, the PTA, approached her about these issues. And the principal replied, "What do you want better teachers for? You're not going to amount to more than construction workers." And this teacher had been in the community for over 20 years. So there was a generational knowledge and experience with her as not really being too caring about the education of the children in the community. One local official in particular, who was related to the school principal and angered by their persistent demands for a meeting, responded to them, "Pues no voy a hacer más por otra gente que por mi propia sangre." He was actually the principal's uncle, right, who was in a local position as supervisor, and he said, "I'm not going to do more for other people than for my own blood." So the mothers decided to do a takeover of the school. And on the evening of August 24th, they parked a huge bus at the entrance of the school and didn't allow anybody in on the first day of school on August 25th, right? They presented a list of demands along with 51 signatures in support of their demands to a local newspaper in the city of Morelia, the state capital, La Jornada, Michoacán. And one of the mothers recalled the events with laughter. The takeover lasted over a month. We had to take turns to keep guard. We had parked the bus by the entrance to not allow anyone in. We didn't sleep, and we would get all wet because it was the rainy season. So they did this again to show their protest for the conditions, and they demanded the principal's resignation. Unfortunately, they were removed, and brutally removed from the site. Lalo remembered the day when this happened. I was working with my compadre Julio very close to here, and suddenly he told me, "I'll be right back, compadre." He looked nervous, but I never imagined why. So he left, and soon after I started to hear women screaming. I ran to see what was happening because my wife was there, and yes, he was there too, knocking down the tents and pushing and pulling the women along with many other people. Rosa Marta also remembered the day vividly, and I'll read this in Spanish. Nomás hubieras visto que se me deja venir el maestro viejo cabrón, el que le pegó a mi hijo, y como ya nos traíamos ganas, que me da una cachetada, pero que se la regreso, y luego lo agarré de las greñas y ya ni supe qué pasó. Cuando ya nos apartaron, yo traía un mechón de sus greñas en la mano, llena de sangre. So this also shows that the mothers were not passive. They really believed in their cause and were ready to defend themselves, right? So once they were removed from the school, they started to seek other options, right? They thought about sending their kids to other local communities. They also thought about starting their own school, but they didn't know how. And so they knocked on many doors. And they went to visit a local principal in a Purépecha-speaking community. You might remember that in this community, Purépecha is no longer spoken, right? So Carolina, one of the mothers, recalled, "El director de Arocutin nos echó la mano. Nos ofrecieron servicios de educación indígena usando la clave que ellos tienen. Ellos son Purépechas." So this principal from the town of Arocutin offered them indigenous education services, which indicates to me, right, that the community was perceived as indigenous, at least somewhat, right, by Purépecha speakers themselves. However, she still makes the distinction, right? They are Purépechas as different, right? Tito, one of the more active fathers, recalled how they actually built the school once they were given these services. You should have seen. No, now the school looks okay in 2011. I did feel embarrassed about the school, but I couldn't backtrack. The municipal president in Eronga, which is short for Erongaricuaro, gave us his support. He gave us some metal walls that were part of a clinic they used to have over there, and we went to pick them up. It was like trash, but we brought them here, and with those, we put up the walls for the school. And I think it's symbolic, right, that it was discarded metal that they were reusing, right, in this context of neoliberalism, right, where people are working with and reusing the scraps that they are getting, right? The principal, when interviewed in 2010, said, "Hay gente que está en contra de Nueva Creación." That was the name of the school, the temporary name of the school, en esta comunidad. "Y nos acusan de imponer nuestra cultura con las familias y los niños." nosotros no venimos a imponer nada. Este pueblo tiene usos y costumbres. Nosotros basamos nuestra pedagogía en usos y costumbres. Tal vez perdieron la lengua, pero sí tienen su cultura. And so there was this perception, right, that being indigenous was not just language, right, that it had to do with culture and cultural practices. This is a picture of the school, and you could see these are the metal sheet walls that they were taking. They added to the school over time more permanent buildings. Right? This is one of the meetings where the mothers met, where they were planning to demand that the state government give them an official name and an official permit to run the school. And so years later, I asked the mothers, what were their perspectives of indigeneity after some time had passed? I conducted 21 survey interviews and then some semi-structured interviews. 19 of the 21 parents identified as indígena or indigenous, and 2 identified as mestizo. To probe further, I asked, what does indígena mean to you? And Cuca responded, we are all Indians, no? We don't speak Tarascan, but we are Indians. Purépechas are from Marocutin, Jaracuar, Uricho. They speak Tarascan, but indígenas, we are. They are already teaching the children all that they already know, a few words. It's like now we are indigenous because they teach the children Tarascan in school. And so, of course, you can read through this and think, okay, well, what do they mean, right? Yes, we are indigenous, but at the same time, they are purépechas. And this is where it gets interesting, right? Because I think that in the process, they developed their own sense of indigeneity, right? Outside of the boundaries of what traditionally had been labeled indigenous. And the school actually became a very important source of that resurgence in indigeneity. And Daniela asked the same question. She said, we are not Spaniards. I think we are not purépechas because we don't speak, but indígena, at least, yes. Yes, we are. Cruz also asked the same question. Pues, ser indígena es saber convivir, estar en la comunidad, participar en las fiestas, en las faenas. Yo sé que no hablo purépecha, pero ¿quién me va a decir que no lo soy? Si yo conozco gente que sí habla purépecha y no quiere hablarlo porque le da vergüenza. Le da vergüenza decir el nombre de su pueblo. ¿Eso los hace ser más indígena que yo? No, no creo. So here they're getting into other deeper meanings of what it means to be indigenous, right? That go beyond the superficial markers that are meaningful. I'm not discrediting them, right? Because language and other forms of knowledge carry deep meaning. But they're also referencing internalized oppression, right? And what that means in contexts where people are identified as indigenous, but don't necessarily embrace that identity. And finally, Catalina said, where do you draw the line between them and us? Them, those who can speak Purépecha, or us who don't? Where? Besides the language, we are so close. We are so similar. We do the same things. The line doesn't exist. We are the same. So what are the implications of Nueva Creación? In terms of identity as a basis for collective action and the transformation of historical contentious practice, this indígena identity allowed them to actually challenge the historical tension that had existed with the school since its inception. I found some documents from the 1920s, from the 1930s, where attendance at the school was a huge problem. The teachers kept writing letters to local authorities, telling them to threaten the parents that if they didn't send their kids to school, they were going to be fined, that they were going to be jailed. And this was something that's been very common with a lot of indigenous communities who have resisted schooling. And I'm referring to schooling, not necessarily to education, right? I think there's a difference between schooling and the institutional process of going to school versus acquiring an education. So indígena, the identity indígena, becomes a challenge to state structural definitions of who is indigenous that go beyond language and dress, right? So they carve out another space, an alternative space for indigeneity, right? Their movement also upsets the Indian and non-Indian dichotomy by creating an alternative space for indigeneity. And I'll get into what that might mean in the neoliberal context later because, it can go both ways, but I think it's meaningful that it does disrupt it. It also challenges the romantic discourse of the disappearing or the disappeared Indian, right? The Indian in the pyramids, the Indian in the codices, to modern ways, right? Modern forms of indigeneity. Because it doesn't die out. My argument is that it doesn't die out with the loss of language and dress, right? Especially in this context where more and more language loss is occurring, right? There has to be an argument for the continuity of indigeneity. This movement also shows the value that the mothers placed on education, right? And what they were willing to go through to be able to provide their kids access to education. It shows that indigenous women are not passive and that they're not victims, right? But that they're very active in community struggles. This movement also shows local control of institutions and their struggle to control local institutions as a remedy to generational educational neglect. And also that the school became a source of co-labor, right? What in the community is called faena. Faena are required labor, community labor. And everybody has to go work, right? Everybody has to contribute their labor. Even if you're upset with someone and, because they, you had a fight with them a month ago and, he punched you, you still have to go work next to him because it's a community effort, right? But more importantly, what does indigenous collective rights claims in the neoliberal multicultural state mean, right? How does the current neoliberal context of displacement through land dispossession, narco-violence, and precarity encourage changing notions of indigeneity? What do these new forms of indigeneity mean, right? For the mothers, they developed a multi-layered discourse of indigeneity that allows them to exist as indigenas, right? They couldn't claim to be purépechas, but they could claim to be indigenas and to enjoy some of the benefits of neoliberal multiculturalism. Neoliberal multiculturalism grants recognition, cultural recognition and linguistic recognition of indigenous communities in limited forms, right? So even without state sanction, they enjoyed some of those limited forms, right? In what Charlie Hale has called the era of el indio permitido, right? New permitted ways to be indigenous, right? Outside of those structured boundaries. What did it mean in terms of the mothers finding for their children an alternative schooling and path to the few viable opportunities available to them in an agricultural community increasingly without agriculture, and with a growing youth drug culture and drug economy and few local paying jobs? Well, this neoliberal multiculturalism also, while it recognized the existence of indigenous communities, their cultural and linguistic rights, also promoted the development of institutions specifically for indigenous people, right? The indigenous teachers' colleges that were created in the late 1990s to create new generations of indigenous teachers to teach in indigenous schools. The Indigenous Polytechnic Institute in the community of Cheran, and in the 2000s, the Indigenous Intercultural University System, right, which is tuition-free and open enrollment for any indigenous student. A lot of times, their participation in Nueva Creación, or in this new school, was encouraged by the local teachers as a form of acquiring human capital, right? Becoming multilingual, not just in Spanish, but also in Purépecha, and also being able to access these institutions which would have been, they would have been excluded from had their children not been enrolled in indigenous intercultural education. And also, Nueva Creación is a bilingual intercultural community, strengthening the sense of collective struggle, played an important role in rekindling comunalidad as a basis for indigeneity for the mothers and their children. And you can argue that that's because of their sense of struggle in terms of whoever they were against, but also the sense of communality that they developed in being able to develop the school, construct the school, and run the school with very little, if any, institutional support. So in terms of concluding critical questions, I don't want to romanticize the mother's struggle either, right? So I don't want to leave you by saying that this, it was all heroic and that this is not problematic at all, right? So I end with some critical questions. How did the eventual concession of Nueva Creación by local authorities divert attention away from larger struggles of oppression, right? How did the concession of the official school in 2002, when they were finally granted their official school permit, minimize the potential for larger unified struggles against neoliberal dislocations, especially since Nocutzepo mothers had already joined in struggle with neighboring pueblos that were also demanding better education for their children. Because in their struggle between 2005 and 2012, when they got the official code, they actually participated in road blockages and protests and going to Mexico City with other indigenous communities who were also demanding schools. So how did this, in some ways, appease them and halt these larger movements? And finally, how did the victory that Nueva Creación represented to the mothers also fix discourses, identities, and people into regimes of governance? Right? How did these discourses fix them into an indigeneity that is the product, in some ways, of these neoliberal discourses? Right? These waves of ethnic revivalism, right, or ethnogenesis, that has also been attributed to late capitalism. And so finally, today the Nocutzepo community still struggles with having 2 elementary schools with inadequate facilities. Benito Juarez, the original school in conflict in 2005, finally got new bathrooms in June of 2016, 11 years later, while Nueva Creación's metal sheet walls were blown away by a strong whirlwind on March 14th, 2015. This is an image from a newspaper. And they have yet to be fully rebuilt. Thank you. So I guess this is the question and answer period. Once the production of our avocado increased, the narcos began to kidnap the owners of the avocado fields, of the orchards. They began to use and to purchase land themselves to grow avocados, to launder some of their money. They also began to demand quotas from avocado growers, a certain percentage of their product or of their returns. And when there was resistance to it, for example, in 2007, the Zetas did a complete shutdown of the avocado production. They burned orchards. They do anything. They block roads. They burn buses. They kill entire families. And so people began to actually pay the quotas or to allow them to use the land, a lot of times to have clandestine laboratories in the mountains. There's also a lot of illegal lumbering that gets done once they acquire these lands. And also, they've effectively shut people out of their own lands by building ditches, by building walls, and by standing guard. Very deliberately just standing guard and not allowing people in, right? They also have control of the lemon industry in southern Michoacan, and they did a shutdown of the lemon industry, I think it was 2 years ago. So whenever there's a hike in prices or there's a lack of access to the product, it usually has to do with whatever is going down there. And so right now, in 2016, there's the narcos, there's the autodefensas, there's the federal police, there's the local police, right? And people who are not involved in this, they don't really know even who to trust, right? Because one group might come in one day, another group might come in another day. For example, when we got there in 2009 in August, the cartels went door to door, demanding that people surrender any kind of weapon that they had, just with their guns. Just give us any weapon you have, any gun, any shotgun, anything that you have. So they very deliberately do a lot of this, and a lot of times they are also connected to politicians. They're connected to politicians, even with the war on drugs that Felipe Calderón launched in I think it was 2006. It didn't really help. If anything, it fueled more of this work, right? And a lot of times people, to protect themselves, they seek their help for protection. So certain communities are under the protection of a cartel, for example, while other communities are under the protection of an autodefensa. So, people are really just trying to live their life, right? Without getting hurt. Because a lot of the autodefensas were claiming their right to defend their communities as indigenous people, as people connected to their ancestral lands. And so I think it helped. However, there wasn't a rise of autodefensas in Nocutzepo, which is interesting, as there were in other communities. And so Nocutzepo was actually being protected or guarded by the autodefensas in a place called La Zipequa, which is about 5 or 6 kilometers away. But for the most part, you know, it helped, I think, in that sense of indigeneity. You know, what does the communality that the school is fomenting, what does it look like, right? Besides, you know, reviving festivities. For example, one of the slides shows this, for example, is the celebration of Carnaval, which is a very indigenous celebration. It hadn't been celebrated in the community for over 45 years, right? And it was actually rekindled through the school. And in the last 2-3 years, the entire community has actually participated, not just the people that are involved in the school. They've also revitalized, you know, the practice of bartering, not with the understanding of an equal exchange, but of establishing relationships of reciprocity and of mutual care through the participation of the community in el trueque purépecha, or the mochtankunti, and also having the children have their own version of this. The philosophy of the school, and there's a whole series of documents that I have that outline it, is that they are not going to impose anything. They're going to work with the saberes, with the knowings and the cultural practices existing in the community, right? And with the cultural memory of practices that have already maybe disappeared, right? And so, but not to impose on this community the cultural practices of another community. And so that is the basis for a lot of what they do. Now, I think what's interesting about Mexico is that it didn't recognize itself as a multicultural country until 1992 in preparation for NAFTA, right? When it altered the Constitution to recognize that it was a multicultural country. And it didn't provide any kind of legal defense for indigenous people's cultural rights and linguistic rights until 2001, based on the San Andres Accords of 1996-97, right? There wasn't a national indigenous languages law until 2003. And so, you know, a lot of these efforts are the product of neoliberal multiculturalism, right? But they are limited in that same way because, you know, it's not meant to have the empowering impact that it's supposed to have, right? And a lot of this actually came out of the Zapatistas' rebellions in 1994, right? And all of the movements, the indigenous resurgence movements that came out of the Zapatistas in 1994. That's not to say that there weren't indigenous education projects before. Actually, in Michoacán, one of the first education projects, indigenous education projects, was in Michoacán in the 1930s and 40s. El Proyecto Tarasco, which was carried out in Cherán, which was a educational program where they used the Purépecha language to teach Spanish. So it was assimilationist, and it was also a project to Castilianize native people, right? There was also a Proyecto Carapan, which was a total failure because the community completely rejected the project. So it's not that these, you know, programs haven't existed, right? But at least at the federal level, that there was the cultural recognition, it didn't really come until after the Zapatistas, right? In its current form. There were forms of recognition through INI, more romanticized versions, right? But in its current form, it really changes after 1994. And there was a huge impulse in change also in 1992 with Rigoberta Menchú receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, right? So it was a whole, you know, world movement in a lot of ways, right? And that's why I think the emphasis on history and context is so important, because the struggle of the mothers is important and significant, but it wouldn't be as significant if we didn't have a lot of this background knowledge and understanding of the current state of things. A lot of the men, you know, if they weren't out working, they were migrating. I mean, migration really took off after the 60s. At least some of it was temporary to local cities, to urban centers. Some of it was more permanent to the United States. For example, my father came to California in the 1960s, 1968. I mean, it's a good question. And there were men involved, but it was predominantly women who were involved. It was predominantly women who were on the buses, who were on the marches. And it's been predominantly women who have actually taken the charge of rekindling a lot of their old crafts, embroidery. They've formed women's collectives because the men aren't producing through agriculture or through the migration sometimes. They've formed collectives to go and sell their embroideries in other parts of Mexico. Since tourists are not coming to them, they're going to the tourists. Some of them have set up websites to be able to sell their products beyond, their local limits. And it's interesting because there wasn't an internet access in 2009 and 2010 when I was there for a full year. But once they brought it in through a local internet cafe in, I think it was 2011, it's really taken off. And Facebook and, Instagram and Twitter. I mean, people are always now in like constant communication and constant, constantly sending messages. I mean, we know about things that happen there, very quickly. And they know about things that happen here also very quickly. Choice is a discourse of neoliberalism as well, right? And so a lot of people have framed having 2 elementary schools as enabling people to have a choice, right? However, in terms of how people have aligned themselves according to the school, I mean, it really just depended, right? Some families split up over the issue and didn't speak for a long time unless they had to go and work together for the faenas. When we were there, they held the graduation ceremonies the same day, which, graduation ceremonies in these communities are a big celebration, right? And the whole community participates. And so some people were heading up, to the one school. Some people were heading down to the other school. And I'm not going to say that, that conflict is typical in a lot of indigenous communities, but in this particular community, there's been a lot of conflict historically. In the 1970s, when there were 2 schools, there was conflict. In the 1950s, when there were 2 schools, there was also conflict. And I think the beauty even within that is that whenever the community needs to come together, it still does, right? It also shows that the community is dynamic, right? Because I think a lot of times we see difficult change or difficult things happening as bad, when I think a reframing of that, if it doesn't have, lethal consequences, it's still dynamic, right? It still regenerates a life. And so I think that's important. There was conflict in the 30s between the agraristas, and the synarchists, between those that supported the Catholic Church and those that wanted to burn the church down. So it's always been, and maybe this is a historical question for a historian interested in this. There were documents from the 18th century. Well, in the 16th century, on the map that I was referencing, there are 2 communities, Nocutzepo and Aramuntaro. In the 18th century, those communities are labeled the same, Aramuntaro, Nocutzepo. Then Aramuntaro drops off in the 19th century. So I don't know if even some of this division is a communal division of 2 communities brought together by colonial authorities that didn't want to be together. But I don't have the time, and I don't know what it would take to actually be able to show that historically. So they authorized the official permit, and they pay the teachers. Other than that, there isn't any other kind of support. So a lot of the resources come from the families themselves. At the other school, they just built a new building. They built new bathrooms, like I said. And so there is more support for that school. Historically, that's been the school of the community, right? But at the same time, they have made no effort to try to bring the 2 schools together. And that's why I said, that these neoliberal moves to grant rights right, and access, but also to keep them at limited stages, right, with few resources is characteristic of this late capitalist time, right? So what are the long-term consequences of this? At least from what we can see now, a lot of the kids that have attended the indigenous school have done better in school. They've continued their studies in Pátzcuaro, the nearest cities. Some of them have gone on to indigenous boarding schools where they live in these residential schools. So I'm not necessarily saying that the education there is better, but at least from what we can see, it's opened access to better educational opportunities, at least more long-term educational opportunities. Thank you.